Hi, this is Jared from Strong Roots Farm. This is Why Grass-Fed, episode 3. On today's episode, we're going to talk about grass-fed, the term, labeling on meat. If your meat says grass-fed, what does that mean? Perhaps you go to a farmer's market and the farmer tells you this meat is grass-fed. What does he mean? That's coming up next. Well, as we get started today, you may notice I'm not at the farm. We are camping. It is July 4th weekend, sitting out in our chairs, kind of enjoying the family a little bit, about a half an hour away from the farm. And so we have to go back every day and check the cows and all the stuff that's going on there. But it's a good opportunity for us to get away with the family and enjoy the outdoors and all those things. So a little bit of vacation this weekend. So if you hear some kids riding by on bikes or hear somebody scream, I'll try to edit all this stuff out. That's what's going on. Okay, first, I need to do some disclaimers. So you're gonna see some clippings from the internet, like different websites, USDA and FSIS specifically, as well as some different farmers websites. I'm not picking on anybody specifically. The reason I chose these was because they came to the top of the feed when I Googled, and I wanted to give you the same information that you could look up, but give you truth. The other thing is you're gonna see some clippings from grocery stores. I'm not supporting any grocery store. I'm not paid by any grocery store. I have nothing affiliated, and I have no ill will towards any grocery store or website that we see today. Today's video is all about giving you the truth and going through that. So let's get started. First, you must understand that the regulating government body that chooses these labels, chooses the definitions, and then enforces them and regulates them. You need to understand who they are. The first one is the USDA. More specifically, within the USDA is a group called the FSIS. So the FSIS, or Food and Safety Inspection Service, is an agency within the U.S. Department of Agriculture that regulates these labels. In fact, if I'm a farmer and I want to acquire a label and label my meat a specific way, I have to fill out forms, go through my local Department of Agriculture and acquire that label. It's not something I can just throw out there as far as labeling on the meat, which is the key thing. With every law and every regulation, there are standards. So for instance, you are supposed to drive 55 miles an hour. That is the speed limit. You must stay under that. And we all know how this works. The government regulating body decides to punish at a certain level of speed that you go over. And the fines go up with, the infraction. But if you don't get caught, then it's not breaking the law. Or is it? There's arguments there. But if there's no fine, if there's no punishment for people for speeding, they're gonna speed. And so with every regulation, it's who comes after them and punishes them for this. So I'm gonna go into some of that in this video, but understand that some of the reasons for why things are the way they are with meat labeling is because who is there to enforce it and what is the punishment for doing it wrong. It may seem silly that I'm talking about the speed limit when we're talking about meat labeling, but it is important to know whoever is regulating this rule or these rules on meat in your local or state or federal level is who is going to determine this label or the infraction for lying or how much people can falsify things and spread misinformation. It's time for the truth. So the word grass-fed, all one word. The word grass-fed, meaning grass-fed, but there's a hyphen between it. The word grass space fed and 100% grass-fed. These four terms are all synonymous according to the USDA. So for the remainder of the video, I'm just gonna say grass-fed and you'll know that they're all the same. And that slide came from FSIS.org and or .gov, I'm sorry. And I will start putting these slides up. I'll leave them up for 1 second So if you want to pause and read just so you can check me, but I'm going to put them up for the evidence. So as we talk about grass-fed, what does that mean? Okay, so the term grass-fed, when you're choosing a piece of meat, has three specific things for the farmer. One, it's what they eat, and I'll go into all these. Two, it's how they eat it. And three, it's where the animals live. So let's go into it. What can they eat? So obviously it says grass-fed, they can eat grasses, but it's a little more than that. So it talks about solely foraging. So I want to explain this, and if you have a yard, hopefully you understand. Rye is not a grass, it's a grain, but in its juvenile state, rye is a grass. Most of the grass in people's yards, turf grass, comes from rye. If you let that grass grow up, it will produce a grain. You are allowed to forage rye as long as it's pre-grain state. So there's many other things as you break down in the term of grasses, brassicas, legumes, all the different things, but the animal must get in its entire diet solely from forages. So that's what it must eat. The animal must be able to forage or graze. So at no point can the animal be locked into a building to eat confined into a building. It must be able to graze. Now, it can graze hay, winter. You can feed hay in the winter or silage in the winter, but the animal has to have the ability to go out of a building and eat that hay or silage. It cannot be confined into a pen to eat that. So how it eats it, it needs to be able to graze it or move around in order to graze it. And where does it live? It cannot live solely in a barn. It has to be able to leave at all times if it wants to, leave this barn and graze, go out and graze to the field. It cannot be pinned up. So each of those slides that you saw came from the USDA or the FSIS, which once again is the government regulating body. So that is the definition. That is what you have to eat, how you have to graze, and where the animal has to live. It's all in there, but more so than just reading it, I called the USDA. I sat on the phone for an hour and pushed a bunch of buttons, eventually having to leave a voicemail. I sent an email, and 4 days later, somebody finally called me back. Now, when they called me back, the lady was super nice. So I think maybe they're just understaffed or whatever, but she called me back. We talked for almost 40 minutes. Wonderful conversation. The lady that worked there, I wish I had her name and her extension, but didn't get all that. But she confirmed everything that I've said in this video, and I wanted to make sure I got verbal consent or verbal confirmation from the USDA. And she also, we talked about some few other things, which I'm going to talk about here in a bit. So once again, when you see the label grass-fed, it means that animal only ate grass, 0 grain fed, 0 grain ever in its life. But there's one little loophole. When I was on the phone, I asked about this. I said, when does the grain-fed, no grain have to start? And she says the animal's entire life. And I said, well, that's not true, because in this reading it says when weaned from the mother until slaughter, the animal has to have grass. And she says, yes, that's right. And I said, well, what about if they fed an animal a supplement prior to weaning? And she said, well, technically that falls into it, because supplements and minerals are a normal part of the diet that can also go along with the grass. So we had this discussion. So we come to the end of this, and I'm a little bit confused, and she didn't clarify 100% with me. But it seems to me that if a baby calf goes to a creep feeder and would take some food out of a creep feeder and then go back to her mom and nurse and not be weaned, she's technically, the timetable for grass-fed has not been started. So creep feeding a calf prior to weaning is still considered grass-fed. Now, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, they're little feeders out in the field. They don't let the big cows go into them, and in these creep feeders, they sometimes put just minerals. Sometimes it's a feed with some grain in it, just to kind of give them a start. It's going to equate to about like what baby formula is in humans. Something similar to that, other than it's an actual grain. It's not or a powder. It's not a liquid. The grass-fed seems to me, from talking to the USDA and reading it, seems to start from the time of weaning. And if you're unaware, that's around 350 to 450 pounds, depending on your weaning weight, that the calf weighs, which is within 5 to 7 months, even 4 months I've seen people wean. So when from that period of the calf's life until they're slaughtered, they can only eat grass or silage or forage grains prior to pre-grain state. That's the determination. So if you believe that this sounds 100% accurate and this is what everybody believes, you would be wrong, because I've looked up a lot of information and there is a lot of false information. In fact, farm websites like the one I'll show you here in a second says a cow can have grain and still be called grass-fed as long as it always has access to grass. Another farm said all cows are technically grass-fed because they eat hay or grass their entire life along with the grain, which is a lie, which is false. Both of these claims are wrong. If the animal ever has grain, it is not grass-fed. Here is the key and important part. When I was on the phone with the lady from the USDA, we got to talking. Very nice, once again, like I said. And she said that it's a federal regulation. You are breaking federal law when you label meat grass-fed and it's ever had grain. And I said, that's amazing. Well, what about just saying it? She's like, well, what do you mean? I was like, well, what about if I post on Facebook that my cows are grass-fed, but really I've given them grain? She's like, well, there's not really a Facebook police. They're supposed to, locally do that. And we got into this long conversation about people at the farmers markets and saying this and saying that. And it came down to this. It's only the stamp on the meat. So if somebody at a farmer's market tells you their beef is grass-fed and it's not stamped on there, technically you don't have to believe them. It's your word, their word against yours, okay? And their word against the neighbor farmers. So the only thing the regulation does is give you the stamp for the piece of meat. So I'm a farmer, can I just say that? No. According to the lady at the USDA, you can be prosecuted if you were seen to deceiving people. I think that's the key there, is that you're like, it wasn't like, oh yeah, our cows always eat grass, they're grass-fed, and you weren't trying to deceive somebody. But if somebody specifically asks you, are your cows technically grass-fed? And you say yes, all cows are grass-fed, or our cows always have access to grass, and they've ever eaten grain, you've lied to someone to deceive them, and that can be punishable in court. The issue is who's going to come after you? There is a local representative, and I could go and say, hey, Farmer John down at the farmer's market's telling people he's got grass-fed, but he doesn't have that license, and he, doesn't, I know he feeds grain. And they would have to look into it and investigate it, and it would probably be a slap on the wrist, or, hey, you can't say that because you're feeding grain and you're deceiving people. That's kind of where this is going with things. Who is going to catch you? Who is going to regulate it? So how can you know that your meat is grass-fed? You're going to know by knowing your farmer. It's everything that I've been talking about with buying local and buying and understanding where your food comes from and being connected to your food source, as we're not as Americans. You have to know your farmer, and he can go and get that license, or he's allowed to say it's grass-fed if it is. He's just not allowed to stamp his meat grass-fed. So on my business card, it says grass-fed. We only feed our cows grass. Now, has there ever been grain on my farm? Yes. If I call an animal and I want to start it on grain for somebody else, I'm allowed to do that. But I'm not allowed to have them in the same pasture, and we don't. I don't have them in the same barn. None of our animals that we butcher ever get grain from time of weaning when I buy them. So I will have some animals that I'll buy at 500 pounds, 600 pounds, because I buy calves, and the farmer will tell me these have had some grain prior to coming to my farm. At my farm, they never get grain. I keep a record of those. I have 2 right now specifically on my farm that I'm going to have to use a different term called grass finished, which means they were finished on grass, but prior to coming to my farm, I don't know what they had. I bought them at a market, or I bought them from a farmer that told me they might have had some grain. So I can only call those grass finished, which is another USDA term. Which brings us into the last set of terms. Grass fed / or hyphen or space grass finished means the same thing as grass fed. It's synonymous because the animal only had grass its whole life and it was finished on grass. But if it says grass finished without saying grass fed prior, you don't necessarily know what it had prior to being finished on grass. Now that seems weird to me because I don't know any reason that you'd feed a calf grain and then finish it on grass, other than perhaps the connection of buying an animal at a stock market and you're a homesteader and you buy it at 500 pounds and you don't know what it had prior, so you can't say grass fed, you have to say grass finished. Talking to the lady from the USDA, that made sense to her. So she clarified all that and we went over all that. Well, there you have it. Just to kind of do a little recap. If it says grass fed, if you're telling people that you're raising grass fed animals, it can never have grain its entire life. So if you're buying a piece of meat that is stamped grass fed, or somebody at the farmer's market tells you it's grass fed, it should have never have grain. I would ask extra questions. So you say your meat's grass fed. Oh yeah, all our cows eat grass. So has it ever had grain? And that's where you'll get them. No, it's never had grain, or yes, we feed grain, but that's technically grass fed. And I would encourage you to go online like I do and take a picture of the USDA site and keep it on your phone and then pull it up and say, no, farmer, you don't know what you're talking about. And that's not the guy to buy from. Or they'll say, yes, it's had grain. It's only grass finished. Technically, all of our animals eat grass, but I bought this calf in a market, and they're trying to be honest with you about it. They're not trying to deceive you. They were just trying to answer a quick question. Give that guy some grace. They're being open with you. That seems to me, if he's going to be open with you and talk to you about it, it's not like I got you, then that's a guy you can probably trust. Talk to him, ask questions. But if the guy says it's anytime it's ever had grain, and yes, it's grass fed, that's what the USDA means, that's a lie. And then there are people that believe that, and I've seen their websites, I've seen their posts on Facebook, I've heard their conversations, and they don't agree with me. But when I show them the regulations and I call my local representative, they find out the truth. So we're in the age of misinformation. It pays to be informed. Look it up yourself if you don't trust me. I've showed you the slides. You can go to Ask USDA. You can call them up. They have an 800 number. You're going to wait a while, but they're very nice, and ask them the questions yourself. So I encourage you to do that. But know for a fact that when you go to a store and see a grass-fed label like this one, you can know with confidence that that meat was only fed grass, because that's what the regulation says, that they paid for that USDA stamp. So you kind of got to watch labeling. Natural, farm raised, organic, not all of that means grass-fed. Grass-fed is its own term. I have no clue what natural and farm raised means. Where would you raise a cow other than a farm? On the moon? But whatever, they put all these different terms on them. Organic, you can buy organic grains. So if you're looking for grass-fed meat, it must say grass-fed. If this video helps, thanks for watching. Continue along with us. If you have any questions about anything, please comment down below. If you'd like to see any more topics like this, let us know. We'd be glad to make some more videos. If you're local, please come out and visit us. We'd love to have some people show you what we do on our farm. If we can do some consulting like we have in the past, we'd be glad to help you in any way. Our goal is to reach people with good, healthy local food, as well as help young people get started into farming if that's their goal. Once again, thanks for watching.